But Margaret Chase Smith's concern is that apparently on the floor of the Senate, senators have been saying things about other Americans in a manner that frightens her. And the senators have been able to do that because they enjoy a certain kind of immunity for doing so when they're speaking in the Senate. In other words, she is indicting some of her colleagues, unspoken, for crossing a line in the Senate chamber itself. Now, this is particularly serious because it's not an indictment of the political rhetoric of other people or a group or a mob. It's an indictment of her colleagues. And she doesn't say my Democratic colleagues, because I think she has in mind some of her Republican colleagues as well. She is worried about the entire tenor of where Senate discussion and debate has gone. In the paragraph before that, she says, I speak as a Republican, I speak as a woman, I speak as a United States Senator, I speak as an American. And this repetition and self-identification will echo throughout the entire speech. She says in the left-hand bottom there, page 178, and she repeats it several times, I think it's high time for the United States Senate to do some real soul-searching. It's high time that we remembered that we have sworn to uphold and defend the Constitution. And the Constitution as amended speaks not only of the freedom of speech, but also of trial by jury instead of trial by accusation. On page 177, she says, the American people are sick and tired of being afraid to speak their minds lest they be politically smeared as communists or fascists by their opponents. And this is what Amy Gutman says extreme rhetoric tends to do. It tends to create these labels, and it then tends to identify people with those labels without examining them very closely. There are key words. Communist is a key word, fascist is a key word, Nazi is a key word. They're all drawn from the vocabulary of what in American politics has generally been considered to be in a more extreme position. At the bottom of page 177, she says something interesting because this is a partisan speech, interestingly enough. She says, the nation sorely needs a Republican victory. So 1950, is that a presidential election or is that a midterm election? Midterm, yes, this is a midterm election. So she's getting ready to talk about the midterms. This speech is given in June. The midterms are coming up in November. But I do not want to see the Republican Party ride to political victory on the four horsemen of calumny. What is calumny? All of those, you read this in advance and looked up every word you did not know. When are you going to get in that habit? What is calumny?
I believe it's a form of untruth, a lie.
Yes. Could you be any more specific? That's a good guess.
I think slanderous
yes,
lies.
It has to do with personal attack of an untruthful kind. Exactly. Yes. Not just something that's untrue or a lie. Calumny is something that you are accusing someone of in a harsh way, which very often does turn out to be false. And when it's used in this sense, she means it is false. Now, where does the image the four horsemen come from? Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Four horsemen of the apocalypse in religious scripture are not very pleasant characters. They destroy a country, they destroy a people. Fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear. Now, you might figure out your own names for the four horsemen of calumny. The concern here is that fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear will lead to what? If you instill these, what will it lead to?
Well, she says it might allow them to win the election, but it would ultimately degrade the quality of the two-party system and American political discourse.
It will certainly do that. There's no doubt about that. Do we want to live with political rhetoric that's filled with smears, bigotry, fear? No. But what could be an even more serious consequence, Katie?
The apocalypse.
Well,
no, it could destroy democracy, like undermine.
Yes, something apocalyptic in a bad way, where you will have consequences which are outside the law. You will have some sort of violence. There can be a tacit consent given by certain forms of rhetoric for people to act in ways that they otherwise would not act. Proving that link is very hard to do. It's like trying to prove that a 6-year-old who plays violent video games all the while and goes out in the playground, punches somebody in the nose right away, has been affected by those video games. That's actually very hard to prove. It's very hard to prove those direct links. It's very hard to prove a direct link between certain forms of political rhetoric and violent actions. Because very often the people who take those violent actions are already unstable individuals. However, I would argue that there is a link between political rhetoric and extreme political rhetoric and the atmosphere that can be conducive to certain individuals taking violent actions. It's very hard forensically to prove that, but there are many instances of individuals who have taken violent actions whose notebooks, whose computers, and whose letters are filled with a kind of hateful rhetoric that would not normally be acceptable in the country, but that at times does seem to become acceptable. It's pernicious. And Margaret Chase Smith is trying here to make a case against it. And she then says, in various ways, as a woman, as a United States Senator, as an American, which she repeats many times near the end of this excerpt, she says, I condemn a Republican fascist just as much as I condemn a Democrat communist, and so forth. She's trying to get rid of these extremes. Does she succeed? This is June 1950. Does she succeed? No. Alas, the McCarthy era continues on for another 3 years. She does not immediately succeed. Her call for greater decency is heard, but it is not acted upon by many. So this is an example of someone in office, a partisan, calling for an end to this kind of extreme rhetoric, not particularly succeeding. If you have not yet watched the Army McCarthy hearings on the reserved video, please do watch them, because you will see the downfall of Joseph McCarthy in terms of rhetoric. The headnote to this speech, I believe, mentions that it's a man who's actually from Harvard Law School, who is the lawyer for the U.S. Army and defends the U.S. Army against the charges of being filled with communists that McCarthy had leveled at it. And that was a man who finally got McCarthy in a corner in these hearings and said, at last, sir, have you no decency? Have you no decency? And McCarthy was left at the table trying to speak while everyone started filing out. He had lost that confrontation in a serious way. Film, I think, is called Point of Order, because one of McCarthy's favorite tactics as a speaker in a hearing or elsewhere was to say point of order. Why is that would be a favorite tactic in any kind of meeting? For you to say point of order. Sooner or later you're going to be in a meeting that is run by Robert's Rules of Orders or some other parliamentary system, and you're going to need to know this. What is the advantage of saying point of order?
Well, it allows you to interrupt.
Yes. A point of order takes precedence over any other motion or any other speaker. Why? Because the meeting is to be run according to a certain order. And if it is not run according to a certain order, anyone in the meeting has a right to say point of order. But when McCarthy said point of order, he very often did not have a point of order. He had something else he was going to say. And it's remarkable that the presiding officer at some of these meetings did not call him out for that. But McCarthy was capable of saying point of order, and then going off on some other tangent which was not a point of order. Let us now look at Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address. This is, I think, page 219, please. There's a very complicated situation in American life where after World War II and because of the Cold War and the presence of nuclear weapons, America developed a permanent armaments industry. America had never had a permanent armaments industry, believe it or not, before that time. There was an armaments industry during the Civil War in which the North manufactured a lot of artillery and rifles, and the South had trouble doing so because they didn't have as many factories, they weren't as industrialized. The Navy had ships built from time to time, but there was no permanent armaments industry in the United States. It was necessary to create an armaments industry in World War II in order to fight that war. And what happened was that places that manufactured commercial aircraft or cars or trucks were told immediately by the government, once war was declared, you have to convert everything now to the manufacturing of fighter airplanes or bombers or tanks. And there was a stunning and rapid conversion. But it was done in large part by industries and companies that had not been manufacturing armaments. So now the United States has entered a period of history where they have. On page 220, Eisenhower talks at the top of the page about a balance among national programs, a balance between private and public cost and hoped for advantage, clearly necessary and comfortably desirable. This is part of his plea for what he calls good judgment. We talked about earlier in this term, good judgment is actually a very elusive quality to have. He then says, a vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty and ready for instant action so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. That is simply true because of the nature of nuclear arms in the 1950s. It is true because of the speed with which military weapons could be deployed. So it was necessary to have everything at the standby. You never had a drill in elementary school called duck and cover. Well, my generation did. It was to protect us from nuclear war. I still don't know how ducking and covering yourself under a school desk was going to protect you from an atomic bomb, but we did it all the time. And every school had a basement or a room labeled as a bomb shelter for the same reason. The idea was that you would need to do this within 15 minutes, which is true. It doesn't take an ICBM much longer to reach its target than about 25, 30 minutes, and you don't have 25 or 30 minutes warning, you have less. So Eisenhower's right. But then he goes on to say, near the end of that paragraph, we have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. The conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. Now, don't forget, Eisenhower's a military person. He was in the military for many, many years. He served in the Philippines. He then was a general in World War II, and he became the Supreme Allied Commander in World War II. That is to say, he commanded all the Allied forces in Europe in World War II, all of them, in their alliance. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Now, at this time, a huge percentage of the federal budget was being spent on the military, a very large percentage, and it grew through much of the 1960s. A much larger percentage than today, by the way, even though the United States spends a great deal on the military today. I believe that the United States spending on the military is greater than the spending on the military of many other nations combined, including the one that spends the second most. We just overspend everyone in terms of military spending. Nevertheless, it's a smaller percentage of the budget than existed for military spending at the time of Eisenhower and Kennedy. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. But I want you to spend a little time after class sometime looking at the paragraph on 221 that begins disarmament with mutual honor and confidence. It is a call to deliberation and negotiation. And it is a call for disarmament between the United States and the Soviet Union, primarily. Eisenhower's leaving office. The United States was still testing nuclear bombs in the atmosphere. Russia was still testing nuclear bombs in the atmosphere. So were other countries. There finally is signed, after Eisenhower leaves office, a nuclear test ban treaty, which stops atmospheric testing. But Eisenhower is leaving office knowing that he has failed to achieve any significant step in international disarmament. That step succeeds only later under President Reagan and the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, S-A-L-T, SALT 1 and 2, in which it became possible for the United States and the Soviet Union to begin to reduce their enormous stockpiles of nuclear weapons. And I mean thousands and thousands of nuclear bombs on each side. Please, on your own, read that paragraph, because it is Eisenhower's plea for a use of deliberation and negotiation, which itself is a form of language and a form of engagement and a form of understanding, to bring about a deeply significant change. We would all be really unhappy if there had not been significant disarmament brought about in the 1980s. And I will say that, again, we are in danger of losing the effects of that disarmament, and we are possibly entering a new arms race. It is not inconceivable. There are all kinds of discussions now about whether Russia is violating the Short and Intermediate Range Missile Treaty, and whether we should not. Well, we just pulled out of it. So the peril that Eisenhower is invoking here is one that we still, to some degree, though in a different way, are living with.